Då vill jag hälsa välkomna till det här IMS-webbinariet. Heter Blasphemy in Law, a comparative perspective between Swedish and Finnish legislation. Mitt namn är Douglas Mattsson, doktorand vid Södertörns högskola, och med mig här idag så har jag Victoria Enquist, docent i konstitutionell rätt vid Uppsala universitet, som forskat om mänskliga rättigheter och just skärningspunkten mellan olika rättigheter. Och jag vill även hälsa välkommen till Thomas Öster, vid doktor i religionsvetenskap vid universitetet i Helsinki, som forskat om just finsk blasfemilagstiftning. IMS, för er som inte känner till det, är ju ett forskningscenter vid Södertörns högskola som står för forskning om mångreligiositet och sekularitet i Sverige. Förutom de här webbinarieserierna så har vi även utbildningspaket som riktar sig till kommuner och regioner som man kan läsa mer om på vår hemsida. Och ja, jag ska egentligen inte säga så mycket mer än det mer praktisk information. Vi kommer först ha 2 stycken presentationer från Victoria och Thomas och en diskussion dem emellan med mig. Och sedan kommer vi öppna upp för frågor eller kommentarer med publiken. Och då kan ni gärna använda den här funktionen som heter Q&A som ni hittar nere till höger i menyfliken. Använd alltså inte chattfunktionen utan den här Q&A-funktionen istället. Och era frågor kommer ställas anonymt så att vi kan inte bekymra oss om sådant. Okej, med det sagt så börjar vi det här webbinariet, och jag vill först hälsa välkommen då till Victoria Enquist. Om du kan säga lite kort innan om dig själv först, så börjar jag dela din skärm sen efter det.
På svenska eller på engelska?
Just det. Vi kommer köra webbinariet på engelska för allas, så alla hänger med. I'm sorry, we will do it in English. You're right, Victoria. Thanks for reminding me.
Yeah, my name is Victoria Enquist, and I'm an associate professor in constitutional law at Uppsala University. And my research is mainly focused on human rights, especially on freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and also freedom of assembly. And I also work a lot with children's rights. I think that's enough for my presentation. Yeah, and shall I start with my presentation now?
Yes, I will just start sharing your screen. 1 second.
Yeah,
make
good.
sure it works.
Okay, you can put it on now. And the first, you can go down to the second picture. This seminar will focus on the issue of blasphemy legislation. And there is currently no such legislation in Sweden. But the issue has recently come into fore with the Koran burnings that took place in 2020. The historical background is that historically there has been blasphemy legislation in Sweden for almost 400 years. I will give you some examples. The misdemeanor code, as early as 1734, the misdemeanor code contained a rule that reads as follows: anyone who intent by word or writing blasphemes or defames God, his holy word, and the sacraments shall lose his life. If he does it unconsciously and hastily, and if he repents, he must pay a fine, and so on and so on. Another example is Freedom of the Press Act. In the 19th century, the press freedom offenses could be divided into 4 groups, one of which was attacks on the religious order. Penal provisions were made for blasphemy of God, denial of God, and the afterlife or the evangelical doctrine, and the defilement of public worship, the word of God, and the sacraments. Since then, there have been various forms of blasphemy legislation. Closely related to the blasphemy offenses was the legislation on freedom of religion and the Act of Belief in the middle of the 20th century. With the introduction of this legislation, it became possible for Swedish citizens to leave the Church of Sweden and to join other state-approved congregations. And in the Act of Freedom of Belief, it was stated that anyone who publicly insults anything held sacred by the Church of Sweden or any other religious community operating in the country shall be sentenced to a fine or to imprisonment for an offense against freedom of religion. In the new constitution of 1974, the instrument of government, the protection of religious freedom, was further clarified and strengthened. So it became an even stronger protection for religious groups and individuals. You can change the picture now. Case law. There isn't much case law in Sweden about blasphemy, but there are some interesting cases throughout history. I have made a few selections, the first being heresy and the others being blasphemy. As early as in 1310, Botulfsson, a farmer from Ösby, had said out loud one day after communion that he did not believe that the bread and wine in the communion were the body and blood of Jesus, so that everyone could hear it. And then he did almost the same thing again. When Botulf knelt down in front of the priest, he asked, according to the documents, "Well, Botulf, you still believe that the bread is the body of Christ?" Botulf is said to have looked the vicar straight in the eye and replied clearly and firmly, "No. If the bread were really the body of Jesus, you would have eaten it alone long ago. I don't want to eat the body of Christ. I would like to obey God, but I can only do that in a way that is possible for me. If someone were to eat another person's body, wouldn't that person take revenge if they could? How much would God take revenge, who has the power to do so?" And for that, Botulf was burned at the stake. In 1884, August Strindberg was prosecuted for blasphemy in the so-called Giftas trial, because in a short story he had described communion, wine and wafers as common foodstuffs. The trial ended with Strindberg being acquitted. A newer case, and a very interesting case from the early 1960s, concerned a radio program broadcasted in the Swedish radio. The episode had been written by 3 authors in consultation and with the intention of broadcasting it on the radio the same day. The radio program features satire about merging petrol stations and churches. 3 people participated in the recording of the program. The prosecutor brought charges against the authors and the participants, claiming liability for offenses against religious freedom, alleging that they had publicly insulted the Eucharists, which is held sacred by the Church of Sweden. In a judgment from 1964, the Stockholm City Hall Court stated, inter alia, that it could not be questioned that the statements had been made publicly and that the statements had a particularly wide scope and that special care must therefore be taken. The court stated that there could be no doubt that the words in the program were intended to mock and something about that was considered sacred by the church. Furthermore, mockery or ridicule, which is not made in the context of criticism, if it was otherwise sufficiently strong, was to be included in the concept of insult, and that, in the opinion of the court, the program contained a lack of consideration in the manner of expression, which was offensive to people's religious feelings, to such an extent that an insult had been made. The 3 defendants were guilty of an offense against religious freedom, and one of them of instigating such an offense. And all the defendants were fined. The judgment was appealed to Svea Court of Appeal, which delivered the judgment in 1965. And the court found no reason to change the previous judgment. And then the request for appeal was rejected by the Supreme Court in 1967. Du kan byta. Blasphemy, from a legal perspective, the issue of blasphemy legislation in Sweden is closely linked to freedom of expression and how far this freedom really extends. The statute in the Penal Code of Offences against freedom of belief and the corresponding rule in the Freedom of Press Act were brought up at the 1964 Riksdag, when certain amendments were made. Against the background of the aforementioned prosecution, some employees of the Swedish radio for offenses against freedom of belief, the Swedish Journalist Association stated that to use law to create sectors that enjoy special protection of sanctity simply because certain group of people consider them and call them sacred is, in the opinion of the association, such a serious interference in a democratic country's free exchange of views and free formation of opinion that such an interference cannot be defended under any circumstances. And the next major step then that took place were when the special law protection of religious freedom in Sweden were abolished. The offense of defamation of religion disappeared, and it was replaced by hate speech and disturbance of the peace as criminal offenses. The protection changed from being a protection for the church and faith communities to a protection for individuals. And freedom of expression began to be more and more emphasized in this context. It was stated that a free and open debate in matters of religion can only be of benefit to society, even if an extension of freedom of expression in this area means that this expression will occasionally be used, which may be offensive to certain groups. Since then, freedom of expression has prevailed in this context. Today, we have no blasphemy legislation, but it's important to remember that the current situation is an exception. However, the question of introducing a new blasphemy legislation has come up several times in recent years, not the least in the wake of various manifestations of other freedoms of opinions, such as, for example, freedom of expression and freedom of assembly. Some examples of this are the Echo Homo exhibition, the Muhammad cartoons, and the burning of the Quran. One issue that has arisen in the wake of the Quran burning is the question whether freedom of religion, in particular, the positive obligations, are fulfilled if such expressions are allowed. Another thing that can be worth mentioning is that the burning of the Quran can be seen as hate speech, but not just the burning itself. What is required for a conviction is not yet clear, and it remains to be seen. So that was all from me.
Super. Thank you so much, Victoria. Super fascinating. We will move on with Thomas, which is an interesting case because it mirrors a lot of Swedish development, but then also starkly different at some point. And after that, we can have a discussion between the three of us, and then we open up for questions or comments from the audience. Okay, so Thomas, the floor is yours.
All right, very good. Hi, good day. I'm from University of Helsinki, and like Doug was mentioned, I'm from the study of religion in my case, and I defended my PhD or doctoral dissertation a few years ago in 2019. It was about the Finnish contemporary blasphemy law in particular, and since then I've been working with legal various politics-related topics, religion and society, generally religion and media, religion, the school world, and things of that nature. So I'm generally working with societal topics in particular. And so about the Finnish blasphemy law, I've been following it for quite a few years now. And the law we have now is sort of a renewed section which came into effect in 1998. It replaced the older law, which had been created during the Russian Empire days. And before that, Finland was, of course, part of the Kingdom of Sweden. So we had the similar legislation, or actually same legislation as Victoria just presented earlier during the 17th century. But this was sort of replaced by a more modern take on this law in 1998. And in that case, the legal experts in Finland sort of formulated what they viewed to be a modern sort of version of a historical blasphemy law, but sort of one that would work in a society which is somewhat more religiously diverse and so on, not so focused on Christianity alone, as the historical blasphemy laws have been in Europe. And the parliament, however, saw that a topic slightly differently from the legal experts who formulated the proposal. And the Parliament of Finland voted to include the word God with the capital letter in the letter of law. So that is currently part of the Finnish criminal code as well, prohibition to blaspheme against God. And we will look at the section text soon. In the parliament, there was a very intense discussion over multiple different sessions regarding what the law should even be. Is this even something we as a contemporary society need? Many MPs voiced their concern over sort of the Christian morality, Christian identity, Christian values, beliefs of Finnish majority, or what they assume to be such. And they sort of won the debate because they won the vote, and the majority voted to include the God with the capital letter in the discussion. But that was, or into law, but that was a controversial decision made by the parliament at the time. And then regarding the law itself, so this is what came of that process in the late 1990s. So the code is called Violation or Breach of the Sanctity of Religion. And it states that a person who publicly blasphemes against God, that's the first part, which was added by the parliament at the late stages of the legislation process. And then there's the important part. For the purpose of offending, publicly defames or desecrates what is otherwise considered sacred, a key word, remember that, by a church or a religious community referred to in the Act on the Freedom of Religion. And then it continues to describe crime where one sort of disturbs a religious proceeding. And the penalty is fines or a imprisonment for up to maximum of 6 months. So I should say first that the part which is actually used of this law in Finland currently is the highlighted in green part. So that's the part which still we have convictions. We'll look at those soon under this part of the law. And the sacred was also somewhat discussed in the parliament, what it actually means. So the preliminary legal work, which is sort of a legal source for interpreting this into legal practice, it says that sacred is simply something which religious communities consider to be core, really essential, really important, really highly respected, things of that nature. And the highlighted part, which mentions the church or a religious community, as referred to in the Act on the Freedom of Religion, that means that church means in the Finnish legal jargon the Lutheran Church, similar to the Swedish one, and the Orthodox Church, which have a special legal position in Finland, and other religious communities which are so-called registered religious communities. There is a legal personality tailored for others, and groups may apply to that to get that status from the officials, and when they do, they are then legally protected under this law, as they are the religious community as referred to in the Act on the Freedom of Religion. The other parts, like I mentioned, these laws are not really used. They are more of a obscure details at this point, but I should still mention them. The penalties have been exclusively small fines. No one has gone to prison for doing this, with the exception of one case. But in that case, the blasphemy or this particular charge was in a very minor role. He went to prison due to other reasons. So that's the only exception. But otherwise, the penalties have been well, the penalty size depends on one's income level. So, for example, a MP who was convicted under this law with the MP's salary, which is pretty nice salary, the fine was like 4,000 or 5,000 euros. So that's about the level where we are at with these penalties. And if I move on to my final slide here, so what it actually means, even more through more examples, what it means in practice. So, like you probably already surmised, that this is not dead letter in Finland, it is still applied. here about 1 or 2 guilty verdicts under this law per year. Most judges are lucky if they get one such case on their table during their career, so it's a quite obscure in that sense, but they do happen. There are so the prosecutor general, which is the highest state prosecutor by law, handles freedom of speech related cases usually, because they're considered to be sort of societally so generally important that the highest prosecutor should consider them. And then some of those end up in courts, and they usually then become guilty verdicts later on down the line. And I know details about 20 cases, so I can give you more examples of those if you'd like to hear them. Just one, the most famous example is the case of Jussi Halla-aho, who is a former chair of the Finns party, which is like a politically similar to the Sverigedemokraterna party. You probably know better. And in his case, which was about in the very early phases of his political career in mid 2000s and early 2010s when this happened, he attacked the Prophet Muhammad in his blog post in a quite crude manner, and that sort of led into this charge and guilty verdict. Most cases indeed concern online writings about Islam. It is not really, the case law is not consistent in the sense that you can easily find things which could as well be prosecuted and charged, but they are not, and some things are. And so if they happen to gain a lot of publicity beforehand, that sort of often contributes that the prosecutor then picks them up and it becomes a conviction later on. But so that the case law is like a bit problematic and inconsistent in that sense. It is mostly used in conjunction with the more serious and more well-known international law, ethnic agitation or incitement to hatred, like a hate speech, but it can be other things as speech as well. It's sort of this law is used in a way that the hate speech law or ethnic agitation charge is usually the #1 crime, and then this blasphemy law or blasphemy charge is the secondary crime in the case. So it can be used in conjunction with this one in case religion happens to be featured in the case. The Finnish law is unusual in European comparison. Most European countries have either abolished it or don't use it anymore. There are some interesting examples, but Finland is a curious case in this sense. NATO process in 2022 sort of changed this discussion around this law slightly when this sort of Quran burning started in our neighboring countries. Or in Finland as well, there were some attempts. The Finnish authorities were quick to point out that particularly sent the message towards Erdogan in Turkey, who was part of the NATO discussions, that hey, we're in Finland, we have this law which prohibits Quran burnings, and the police were exceptionally proactive in sort of enforcing this in the demonstration and all that. So there was part of the discussion, and before that, what changed at that point was that if you remember the Times of Jyllands-Posten and Muhammad Khatun controversy in mid 2000s, the Danish newspaper one, the European leaders during that time were sort of saying that freedom of speech is what we are. We appreciate freedom of speech above all else, and this is important for us. But that sort of changed when this security-related themes entered the discussion during this NATO application process. But now, since both countries, Finland and Sweden, are part of NATO, it might change again. But that remains to be seen. But I think I've used my 10 minutes greatly, so I will end here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas and Victoria, for super interesting presentations. Remind people attending, if they want to ask questions, you can do so in the Q&A session. But I want to start with just a discussion between us. First, ask if any of you have any comments to one another that you want to bring or ask questions about. Otherwise, I had one towards you also, Thomas, relating to this and the legislation. It's quite broad as it's framed. And then you did mention this at like when it's used or applied, because it seems like there's a potential for a lot of other artistic expressions or so in the arts or music, the movies and so on, to fall under the law of blasphemy. But it seems that it's not consecutively used, or there's when is it applied basically, and when is it ignored, and perhaps following that also, how can private individuals file a complaint against, say, an artist or a movie, and then do the court not take that up, or like do you know any of the sort of the hidden cases where people are trying to instigate that now we have a breaching of the law in terms of this legislation? If there's any indications of that in your research.
Yeah. Well, I'll start from the end there. So people can approach the police, and the police then investigates and then carries it over to the prosecutors if they see fit. But the artistic sort of topic is a good one, because the discussion which created this current Finnish law, the parliament sort of heavily discussed a very famous Finnish case, also from the 1960s, similar, actually somewhat similar to one Victoria mentioned, where well, there are two cases, but I'll describe the most famous one. Hannu Salama, who was a writer, and he wrote a novel about youth spending summer in a lively way, and they in one part of the book, one of the characters sort of presents a monologue which can be interpreted to be a parody sermon, like a parody of a Christian sermon, and that sort of the Archbishop of the Lutheran Church was offended by that, and he brought it up, made a huge fuss about it, and it sort of eventually ended up as a blasphemy conviction. But the president of Finland pardoned the artist, so that was an interesting development all the way. But that's a one example, and that was sort of featured in the 1990s discussion when the politics sort of politicians debated. We don't want to repeat the 1960s again. We don't want to restrict freedom of expression in artistic realm, and I think that has sort of, that mentality sort of has affected the Finnish thinking around this law as well, that it has not been used once, to my knowledge, regarding any artistic expression. It is mostly contained to the realm of political debate, political discussions in the prosecutions. Most of whom are convicted are somewhat politically active, and they sort of seek to advance particular goals, and they use hate speech and other types of speech in their political action, and that's the nature of the Finnish discussion and case law here.
I actually have a question about, you said that the president pardoned him.
Yeah.
Do you know why did the arguments for pardoning him?
I don't remember specifics, but the general sort of historical context of that is that the president was looking for the liberal, youthful side of the culture wars of the 1960s, because there was this sort of generation divide between the boomers of that time and the sort of the more youthful folk who are the boomers of today, but sort of the generation who was more liberal, more urban, more educated, more pro equality of the genders and so on. And so he looked sort of, and the artists themselves who were charged, and two of whom were also convicted of blasphemy, they were also these sort of young leftists. And so it plays into that.
Okay.
That discussion.
It reminds quite much about the case I presented from the it was also from the 60s, I think,
Yeah.
and it was the same year.
I mean, if I may ask both of you then, this both in the Swedish term then, like when we abolished the law, the political consensus around the questions at the time and currently, I'm also thinking in Finland and in the 90s, like how would you describe the political, whether it's a huge majority for both of these changes, like the abolishment and the implementation or rewriting of the law? Or did you see were there fractions back then, and how is that like currently discussed? Is there still a what do you call it? People still agrees the broad majority within the political parties for the current legislations? If you have any comments on both historically and perhaps contemporary, how that's discussed. Yeah.
This was for both of us, I think. This question.
Yeah.
If I start here, so the interesting bit is that historically the religion state topic has been a sort of quite clear left versus right question. So in 100 years ago, it was the left wing who criticized the very prevalent position of the Lutheran Church. And they sort of were politically aligned with free thinker atheist movement of that time. But that has sort of dissipated since. Today, religion-related topics are not really left versus right topics anymore. They are sort of more liberal versus conservative topics now. So those are different political division which we have today. But back then, which was also visible in the 60s and to some extent in the 90s, if we look at the 90s discussion which created this law, there it was still this left versus right division was still visible, because in that case the right-wing parties were more in favor of the inserting God with the capital letter in the law. Today the situation is that there is a quite large criticism or critical stance towards the law bubbling under in every political faction, but nobody has it on their active political agenda. So there is a sort of wide agreement among the politically active class and legal experts that this law is quite problematic, and it sort of is not our proudest law we are the most proud of making. And this is sort of the general sense of things, but no political party has it on their sort of agenda to remove it either. So we are this strange sort of nether realm in the middle at the moment.
I think that I'm not really sure about the political the different political views, but I think that the state church question has been a very, very big and debated question in Sweden also for many years before they got separated. But it is also a question about the importance of human rights and the consensus about that between the different political parties, because during this time there was a huge debate on the question of the importance of the human rights also. And in Sweden we got a human rights chapter in the instrument of government in the 1970s, and the development since then has been quite dramatic, and human rights has come to have much more importance than then. It has a great importance now. So I think that it's two huge questions that are like in conflict with each other also. The protection of religion, but also and religious communities, and the question of the state relation to the church and other congregations, and also the human rights question.
If I may follow up, we discussed a bit earlier also, Victoria, the sort of the current discussions, as you also mentioned in your presentation, that have been debates specifically relating to the Quran burnings, but in general of the lack or the possibility to stop the demonstrations or hinder them before they take place. But that is tapping into other legal dimensions. I know it's very complicated, but how do you feel that the current discussions, like not in terms of changing the law, but making alterations in other laws in order to have a more of a framework or tools, so to say, that the police or others can use when demonstrations such as those happen?
It's a quite difficult question, and it's an important question also. But the possibilities to make changes in the ordinary legislation is depends on the construction in the instrument of government and in for example the European Convention. So you cannot change the ordinary legislation or create ordinary legislation that isn't in accordance with the instrument of government, the human rights in the instrument of government. So it's a quite difficult question to answer to, because you have to make some major changes to make another kind of protection for these groups if you want to make it more effective. Or these groups.
Okay, I will. We also had some questions here from the Q&A, so I will start those a little bit and encourage people to send in if you have other questions or comments. And here's one I think is directly mostly to you, Thomas, from a participant that says that at least in terms of music and artistic expression, there have been close calls when it comes to Finnish metal bands, ? Certainly there's a self-censorship, according to a musicologist, Sali Altonen, that have reflected on censorship and Finnish metal. But maybe there hasn't been any convictions. But the issue of self-censorship from artists themselves, is that also debate, or do you know any of that research? If people, because the law is there, they preempted with doing some self-censorship, although it might not be conviction.
Yeah. Well, at this sort of the field I know quite less about, but the cases where there has been controversies about, for example, particular bands performing in venues or events, they have been mostly political and not usually much to do with religion. For example, a band may be protested because the protesters feel justifiably or unjustifiably that they are a far-right band that shouldn't be performed in this particular venue or perform at all, and they might be protested because of that. And that's like one, but that's sort of another topic entirely in a way. But I can't think of any cases where religion would have been at the fore, really. There was a case where a band tore I think both Bible and Quran in a stage, and police investigated that one, but I don't think nothing came of that. Another case where this sort of case law is sort of inconsistent, because if you tore a Quran in demonstration, so it's not okay, but in the stage it's sort of somehow more okay. So that is the sort of the problematic side of this case law. One of those. But yeah, generally freedom of artistic freedom is doing quite well from the legal perspective, I suppose. But self-censorship is sort of another question, definitely.
Okay, thank you. Also, like some of these questions you talked about it also, Thomas, how debates or the discourse in Finland has changed a little bit throughout time. Like with the NATO process, it was in the issue of connect to security reasons and so on. and now it might change again. Like, what do we know? Like, which research would you like to see being done in this topic, or do you have any interesting? Where do we lack research concerning these topics today, you think?
Well, I think a lot of things will come of this, just due to the sort of the fact that so a lot of stuff was written in the regarding the Jyllands-Posten controversy because it was so huge, and likewise this sort of ongoing Russian attack on Ukraine and all things related to that, including the NATO membership of or application of Finland and Sweden. There are sort of these historical shifts, so a lot of applications will be created on this, and I think it's good to sort of keep the religion in the mix when we sort of try to analyze this as well. Although religion might not be sort of the primary thing or theme here. Sort of, I think it would be nice to introduce Denmark in this discussion, because Denmark just recently reintroduced a form of religious insult law, as we know, although they had abolished it in 2017, if I'm not mistaken. And there are these various interesting developments happening just recently, which should be scrutinized definitely. Regarding more generally the topic of blasphemy and religious insult, one thing which has been studied much less is the receiving end, or the sort of the religious communities themselves. There are some nice examples. For example, Sabah Mahmood did work in, I think, Egypt, where he interviewed folk around the Jyllands-Posten controversy time, and she dig up some really interesting things from that time. But I think there is room for more of that as well, in addition to this sort of top-down thing I'm doing, or looking at the authorities and politicians.
Victoria, do you feel like currently in Sweden, is there something that would be needed in terms of research to understand these questions and dynamics better today?
I agree with Thomas. It's the same as Sweden, but I think that the security questions is really interesting, and it will tap into a lot of the human rights discourse, and how much the different sides, different aspects are weighed against each other: security, human rights, the individual freedoms like personal integrity, and freedom of religion and freedom of expression, and how to, like, I don't know, balance the things between each other. I think that would be interesting. And how it affects, of course, as Thomas said, how it affects the different groups that are affected by these different actions and legislations.
We also have another question here that's directed to you, Victoria. And I'll quote, if I'm correctly informed, while the blasphemy law is abolished in Sweden, the disturbance of religious service is still a crime. I'm a bit surprised that the police allow demonstrations against Islam, which may or may not include burning the Quran outside mosques, for instance. Has this law about disturbance not been taken into account, or does the law imply a disturbance in the actual room and thus does not take disturbing worshippers on the way to the mosque into account? I know for sure that demonstration outside the mosque at Björns Trädgård, for instance, Sweden, was disturbed the worship for individuals. Parents had to explain to scared children what was going on, and of course some grown-ups were also upset or thrown off balance. So then I guess the blasphemy law being abolished, but the disturbance of religious service, is that still a crime, or is there a difference between those and the legislation?
On the first question, it's a really good question, the whole thing. But the first, if it's abolished or not, I'm not sure actually. But the disturbance must, I think, this is a guess, I think it is in the actual room. But because the disturbance, the judicial meaning of disturbance is quite narrow. But I'm not sure about that, but I completely agree with you about the freedom of religion, for example. if there is a demonstration, it doesn't have to be the Quorum burning. It can be other kind of demonstrations, such, for example, when right-wing extremists are like demonstrating outside different religious housings. I think a lack in the case law is that they haven't taken into account that there is another part, another human rights bearer, and another human right that is maybe in conflict with the rights of the persons who are doing the demonstration or saying these things that are affecting other rights holders. So I think that it hasn't been tried yet in court. So I cannot give you an answer, but I think that it's important because you have to take the whole like human rights discourse into account. So good point.
That's super interesting. So which also opens up, of course, which is the legal. So this would be a potential legal framework that might be used in order to stop, but haven't done so yet. Then, are there any other legislations that could achieve the same goal in terms of, or do we relating to this also? Then?
I think that I mentioned it briefly, but maybe about the positive obligations according to the European Convention, and I think that if it depends on how wide the positive obligations are according to Article 9 in the European Convention, but the state have some obligations to protect people's freedom of religion, for example, then and to protect it from other individuals, not only from the state view, but from others. So if depending on how wide the positive obligations are, it can be used as a balancing for the other actions.
Also thought about, I mean, both in the 60s and so, like, as you mentioned earlier, Victoria, also thinking like the cultural context where these laws first were debated, of course, looks quite different from today's society, which is more multi-religiosity in it compared to previously. Are there any, like, how much do these sort of the modern migration, for instance, into Scandinavian countries has affected these discussions in keeping or abolishing or altering the laws? Is it like, I think it's important to keep in mind this Christian cultural context that was first discussed when these laws were either abolished or kept in place. And for in Finland, like, how is that much of the discussion, the multi-ethnic and multi-religious society of Finland, for instance, in these debates now? You said there's criticism towards the law, Thomas, but you're still keeping with it, and that's sort of changing demographic in some sense, and how that's affect the discussions around these laws of either wanting to keep it or changing.
Yeah. So the I think one important thing to know when sort of comparing Nordic countries is that the Finland is, first of all, Finland is sort of less secularized. Finland is more religious, sort of on average, statistically, than other Nordic countries. And Finland was more modernized as a society more recently. So after the World War II, pretty much began this sort of more larger urbanization development, which by the population also become more liberal in values. But Finland is still sort of slightly more conservative than other Nordic countries. These all play into this. And another difference is that Finland is also less religiously diverse as other Nordic countries, because there has been quite a bit less immigration to Finland due to various reasons. So this is this is an important thing to consider. We did have a large debates about immigration during the 90s already. Finland sort of began slightly larger immigration in the early 1990s during the key phase of the Somalian civil war, but that was another thing. But it's interesting to note that in the late 1990s, when this Finnish blasphemy law was created in the parliament, there was hardly any mention of any other religion than the Lutheran Christianity. So the religious multiplicity did not enter that discussion at all. It was sort of discussed only exclusively in the context of we, Finland, as a Lutheran country, should have a law like this or should not. That was the discussion in the late 1990s. And in 2000s, when sort of the discussions regarding religious multiplicity, multiculturalism, also connecting with various international huge developments in politics, that shifted, and it's sort of the law discussion around this law, which was brand new from the parliaments, it sort of changed into this direction of being primarily about Islam, primarily about political attacks against Muslim immigrants or Islam as a religion. And that was the shift which occurred in the early 21st century. Today, the reason why most political parties don't have this topic as their agenda, I think, is mostly has mostly to do with political sort of strategic calculations or getting and keeping voters, because this topic is not really that important for that many people that they would vote anybody because they sort of suggest that this law should be abolished. It's not that important for that many people. However, more people might be annoyed that party sort of tries to take this away. Are they trying to make sort of Bible a free game or something like that? So that's the underlying political, I think, reasoning why the status quo is the way it is in Finland.
Maybe asking you also then, Victoria, but picking up from what Thomas asked, like, are there any today's, I know at least previously, for instance, Dagen, the Christian newspaper, and those type of movements have been advocating for updating the blasphemy law to bring it back into the fold, so to say. Do you know if there's any groups or either civil society organizations so that are more vocal in wanting to implement or keep make a new legislation that is more in terms of a blasphemy law than we currently have, besides the Christian, right?
I cannot point out some certain groups, but I can. And the question is has come up several times when there have been attacks on, especially or attacks, but that when there have been manifestations that are critical towards Islam, and I think that it can be related to integration and other questions that concerns integration, but it's also I think that it also depends on that we don't have any protection that are protecting people from being insulted, or we don't have any grading. Before, historically, we had, maybe it wasn't used that much, the blasphemy legislation in Sweden when we had it, but it was used in certain cases, and I think that sometimes having a legislation, the importance isn't that it's being used, it's that that there is a protection somehow, because now we have hate speech, but it's quite high standards for something to be hate speech. So the fact that freedom of expression has such a strong meaning in the Swedish system can be good, it can be bad. I have no opinion about that, but I think that some people feel that there is no protection when it comes to when it comes to their opportunities to go to their religious places. And if people are standing outside and it's almost a riot outside there, and that is protected by the human rights, but not their right to be in the certain religious buildings.
Okay.
I don't know if that was an answer to your question, but
no, but it's also a case in point of where the ongoing discussions, let's say, or where also more research can be done in terms of the prioritization, for instance, or how this is discussed in either political document or legal document in the courts and laws and so on. Well, we're running out of time here, so we just give you both the opportunity. First of all, thank you very much for joining in this webinar. I think it's been super interesting, and now we understand these issues a bit better, I hope. I also want to give you an opportunity if you have any last things that you'd like to say or ask one another or so. Or you're good and happy?
Not immediately, no. Good discussion.
In that, yeah, I think it was very good discussion. And the next IMS webinar, exact date is not set yet, but it will be later this March. You can either look us up on our website or on our Facebook. We also have old webinars on our YouTube channel that you can have a look at if you want to follow what we are doing next. Once again, thank you very much, Victoria and Thomas, for joining me today. And I hope everyone has a pleasant Monday.
Likewise. Bye.